She gave him everything: 12 years of her youth, 12 years of silence, 12 years of burying herself to become the woman he wanted. And tonight, the most powerful man in New York pushed his wife onto the bed and uttered 3 words as cold as a knife: "I want a divorce." But what Roman Vescari didn't know, that the woman he had just left was the mastermind behind half his empire. And tonight, Vivian Moretti would remember who she was. If you're reading this story, please like and comment the name of the city you're watching in, so I know how far my story has come. Don't miss the ending, because this is the story of the woman the entire New York underworld will never forget. The penthouse smelled like money and absence. That was the first thing Vivian noticed every time she walked through the double doors of the 63rd floor. Not the panoramic view of Manhattan burning gold and silver beneath her. Not the imported marble floors that cost more than most people's houses. Not even the silence that pressed down on everything like a hand over a mouth. It was the smell. Cold air. Expensive cologne that didn't belong to her husband because her husband had stopped wearing it around her years ago. And underneath all of it, something that had no name but lived in her chest like a stone she'd been carrying so long she forgot it wasn't supposed to be there. She'd been back from the Moretti attorney's office for less than an hour. A routine meeting, or what passed for routine in her world, which meant sitting across from men in $5,000 suits, discussing the kind of financial arrangements most people would spend 3 lifetimes trying to understand. She'd signed 3 documents, reviewed 2 others, and smiled the way she'd learned to smile. Wide enough to look engaged, controlled enough to reveal nothing. The drive back through Midtown had taken 40 minutes in traffic. She'd watched the city through tinted glass and thought about nothing in particular. That was a skill too, she realized. The ability to empty your own mind so completely that you started to wonder whether there was anything left inside to empty. The penthouse was quiet when she entered. That was unusual. Roman's security detail usually had someone stationed near the elevator. Tonight, the foyer was empty. She set her bag down on the console table near the entrance, the one she'd chosen herself from a gallery in Soho 3 years ago, when she still made decisions about things like furniture and pulled off her heels. Her feet ached. They always ached now. She couldn't remember the last time she'd walked barefoot on anything that wasn't cold. She heard him before she saw him, not voices, just movement. The specific weight of Roman's footstep, which she'd catalogued over 12 years the way some women catalog song lyrics or the names of flowers. Heavy on the right side. Deliberate. The walk of a man who never went anywhere without deciding first that he owned it. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows when she came into the bedroom, his back to her, jacket still on. That wasn't usual either. Roman always shed the jacket the moment he came home, complained about the weight of it, dropped it over the nearest chair like a man shedding armor. Tonight he still had it on. Dark charcoal, custom cut. She recognized the set of his shoulders, the particular tension that lived between his shoulder blades when something was moving in his head that he hadn't yet decided to say. She should have turned around. Some part of her, the part that had survived 12 years in this life by listening to instincts she'd taught herself to ignore, knew that. Should have gone to the kitchen, made tea, given him space, given herself space. Done the small, calculated retreats she'd become so practiced at that she barely recognized them as retreats anymore. Instead, she crossed the room and touched his shoulder. It was such a simple thing. Just her hand. Just the silk of his jacket beneath her palm, the warmth she could feel even through the fabric. She touched him 1,000 times, 10,000. But something about the quality of his stillness made her fingers feel like they were pressing against a door that was already locked. "Please," she said. The word came out quieter than she intended. "Stay with me tonight." Roman turned. She'd studied his face for over a decade, knew the exact geography of it, the hard jaw, the nose that had been broken once years before she knew him, the eyes that everyone who met him described as cold, but that she used to believe were simply private, simply guarded, simply waiting for the right person to deserve what was behind them. She used to think she was that person. She looked at him now and couldn't find anything in those eyes that looked like it had ever known her. He reached out. She thought for a half-second that he was going to put his hand against her face the way he used to in the first year, before the empire expanded, before the pressure calcified into something permanent, before she became part of the furniture. Instead, he put his palm flat against her sternum and pushed. Not violent. Not enough to hurt her physically. Just enough to make her step backward and then stumble, the backs of her knees catching the edge of the bed, and she sat down hard on the mattress with her hands braced behind her and her breath knocked clean out of her chest. She stared at him. He said, "I want a divorce." The room was very quiet. Outside, Manhattan kept going. Traffic. Sirens. The low, constant pulse of a city that didn't care what happened inside any particular apartment at any particular moment. Vivian didn't move. "I've spoken with my attorneys." Roman's voice was flat, conversational almost, like he was discussing a contract renewal. "We'll be fair. You'll be taken care of." She heard the words. She understood them individually, but they were arranging themselves in her mind in some order that didn't quite resolve into meaning, the way sometimes you can look at a word so long it stops looking like a word. "Taken care of," she said. "Financially. You'll have the apartment in Milan. The accounts in Geneva aren't community property, but I'll make adjustments." He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, gold cufflink. She'd given them to him for their 8th anniversary. "You're not going to struggle." Roman. Vivian. Something in the way he said her name made her close her eyes, just for a second, because it was so absent of anything. Not cruelty, not guilt, not even the specific flatness of someone working to keep cruelty or guilt from showing. Just nothing. Like saying her name was a formality he was extending out of habit. "You're dull now," he said. "I don't mean that as an insult. It's just the truth. You've been invisible to me for a long time." She opened her eyes. He was looking at her the way you look at something you've already decided to get rid of, something taking up space in a room you need cleared, and he looked slightly bored by the process of the conversation, slightly impatient to be past it, and that was worse than anything else he could have done. She could have survived anger. She knew how to survive anger. She'd been surviving it for years. But this was like standing in front of someone and discovering they weren't seeing you at all, that they were looking at the wall behind you. "Sienna is everything you're not," Roman said. "She's alive. She's present. She wants things. She—" He stopped, seemed to catch himself, shook his head slightly. "It doesn't matter. This isn't about her. You're telling me it's about me." "I'm telling you, you stopped being the woman I married." He said it gently. That was the worst part, the gentleness. Like breaking someone slowly was a kindness because it gave them time. "Years ago, Vivian. I'm not doing either of us a favor by pretending otherwise." Then he turned away, picked his phone up from the nightstand, checked something, put it back in his pocket, went to the closet. She watched him take the tuxedo down from its hanger. He'd had it cleaned for tonight. She remembered seeing it in the garment bag last week, and lay it across the back of the chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched her husband prepare for a gala he intended to attend with another woman, and she did not make a sound. She did not cry. She did not speak. She watched him move through the room with the efficiency of someone who had already decided that the person sitting 6 feet away from him was no longer a person he needed to account for. She watched him adjust the cufflinks, button the jacket, check his reflection in the mirror without looking at her reflection at all. He left without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Vivian sat in the silence of her own bedroom and breathed. In, out, in, out. Her hands were completely still in her lap. She noticed that distantly, like it was a fact about someone else's hands. The city glowed beyond the windows. The room smelled like Roman's absence now, which smelled different from his presence. It smelled like everything that had been pretending to be a life. The tears came eventually. She didn't fight them. They ran down her face and she let them, not because she'd given up, but because she'd been doing this for so long, containing everything, managing everything, surviving everything, that her body needed a moment, a window, something that was allowed to be real. She cried for 10 minutes. She timed it, which she knew was strange, but timing things was one of the habits she'd carried from her old life. The ivory ghost didn't weep over anything she couldn't budget. After 10 minutes, she stopped. She stood up from the bed and crossed to the mirror on the opposite wall. The woman looking back at her was 41 years old and wore pearl drop earrings and a silk blouse, and the kind of expensive nothing that came from years of being costumed rather than dressed. She had dark circles that no amount of money had ever quite managed to erase. She had her mother's jaw, strong, angular, stubborn, and her father's eyes, which were the exact color of deep water, and which every Moretti had carried as far back as anyone could trace. Eyes that looked soft until they focused on something, and then they looked like something else entirely. She looked at herself for a long time. You are still her. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. The words came out in a whisper, barely air, but they landed somewhere. She felt them land. Because the woman Roman Vescari had just thrown away like furniture, the silent, accommodating, invisible woman he'd grown bored of, was not who Vivian Moretti had been before she married him. It was who she had learned to become in order to survive next to him. It was a performance she'd given so many times for so many years that the line between performance and person had blurred until she couldn't see it anymore. But it was still a performance. She was still underneath it. She went to the bathroom and washed her face with cold water, looked at herself again, wet-faced, no makeup, just the bones of her face and those deep water eyes, and the jaw that didn't know how to go soft. Then she went to her private dressing room. Roman had the master walk-in. She'd been given the smaller room off the hallway years ago, a concession she'd made without thinking much about it, and she sat down at the vanity and picked up her phone. She sat there for almost 3 minutes without calling anyone. She thought about her attorney. She thought about the Moretti cousins she still had contact with, the ones who sent holiday messages and never asked too many questions. She thought about leaving the city entirely tonight, just packing a bag and getting into a car and being gone before Roman got home from the gala. Then she scrolled to Dominic. Dominic Vale. Roman's second in command, his closest advisor for 11 years. The man who ran the operational side of the Vescari network, with a precision so clean that even Vivian, who'd been raised in a family where precision was the difference between life and death, had watched him work and felt something close to recognition. He wasn't brutal the way Roman was brutal. He was quiet, calculated. He listened when people spoke, which was rarer than it should have been in the world they all moved through. He'd always been respectful to her, always. Not the specific performed courtesy that Roman's men extended toward the boss's wife, that thing that was really a form of dismissal dressed up in good manners, but something more considered than that. He asked about her opinions sometimes. Real questions. He remembered things she'd mentioned months later. He looked at her when she spoke like she was saying something worth hearing. She'd noticed it. She wasn't sure what she'd done with the noticing over the years. Filed it somewhere. Left it alone. She pressed call. He picked up on the second ring. Vivian. Not surprised. Not quite. His voice had that quality it always had. Low, controlled. The kind of voice that didn't fluctuate much because the person behind it had decided that fluctuation was a luxury. He's leaving me, she said. She hadn't planned to say it that directly, but she was tired of managing her own sentences. Tonight. He told me tonight. A pause. Not long. But she knew Dominic well enough by now to understand that his pauses were not emptiness. They were the space where he processed things faster than other people and decided what to do with what he'd processed. Are you hurt? He said. She opened her mouth to say no. I'm fine. It's fine. The reflexive reassurance she'd been dispensing for years. What came out instead was the truth. He pushed me. He pushed me backward. Off balance. It wasn't... She stopped. It wasn't anything serious. I'm not injured, but he touched you. The quiet in those 3 words. The very specific quality of the quiet. Dominic. He put his hands on you. His voice had dropped to something that sounded almost gentle, except that gentleness was not actually what it was. It was control over something that wasn't gentle at all. It doesn't matter. I'm fine. She put her hand over her eyes. I don't know why I called you. Because you needed to call someone, he said, and I'm glad you did. She heard him breathing, heard something shift on his end, the sound of a room changing, a door maybe. The gala is in 2 hours, he said. I know. Come. She laughed. It came out rough, surprised. Dominic. Not as Roman's wife. He said it deliberately. each word given its own weight. Come as Vivian Moretti. Walk in through the front door as the woman you are, not the woman he's been trying to make you. She was quiet. He's going to walk in there tonight with her, Dominic said. He's going to make it public. He wants to. He wants to reframe the story before you can. She knew that. Of course she knew that. Roman had been managing narratives since before she married him. It was one of the things she'd admired about him once, the clarity of his strategic thinking, the way he was always 3 moves ahead. She'd married a chess player and then discovered that she was one of the pieces. You have 2 hours, Dominic said. After she hung up, she sat in the vanity chair for a long moment, the phone warm in her hand, the dressing room quiet around her. Then she stood up and crossed to the far wall where the custom-built shelving unit ran floor to ceiling. She reached behind the 3rd shelf on the left side. She'd measured it exactly when she installed it. She'd installed it herself, which Roman had found charming and hadn't thought twice about, and pressed the recessed panel until it released. The vault was small, built into the original structure of the building, which meant it predated Roman's ownership by 20 years. He knew it existed. He didn't know what she kept in it. She opened it. The dress was exactly as she'd left it. Black couture, floor length, the kind of thing that took 6 months to make and cost more than most cars, and which she'd bought 3 years ago for an occasion Roman had canceled at the last minute. Dark silver embroidery wound through the fabric like something growing, like vines, like veins, like something with intention. She'd kept it here because she'd known, in whatever part of herself still knew things clearly, that the occasion would come. She took it out and held it in her hands. And standing in her private dressing room in the penthouse that had never really felt like hers, wearing the invisible weight of 12 years of becoming smaller, Vivian Moretti let herself feel, for just a moment, exactly how much she'd buried. Then she went to work. She did her own makeup. She hadn't done her own makeup in years. She had people for that. Appointments. A woman named Celia who came to the apartment on event nights and worked quietly and professionally and never commented on anything. Tonight, Vivian stood at the vanity mirror with the tools she kept for herself and rebuilt her face the way she'd known how to do it before she'd outsourced even that. Not soft, not tasteful, something sharper. Smoky lining around the eyes until the deep watercolor of them became something that stopped people. A mouth that didn't apologize. She dressed alone. She'd forgotten how the dress felt, the weight of it, the specific way it moved. Not dragging, not stiff, but with a kind of intention, the way very good things moved. She stood in front of the mirror when she was finished and looked at herself for a long time. The woman looking back at her was not the woman who had sat on the edge of the bed an hour ago with her hand still in her lap. She was something older than that, older and much more dangerous. Vivian's phone buzzed. Dominic. Downstairs. Take your time. She picked up her bag. The small one. Black, minimal. She'd put 3 things in it. Her phone, a tube of lipstick, and a USB drive she'd been carrying for 2 years that contained financial documents she'd gathered one at a time over the course of 3 years in preparation for a day. She'd told herself might never come. She didn't take anything else. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby and stood very still as the doors closed and the penthouse rose away above her. The elevator descended through 63 floors. By the time it reached the lobby, the weight of those floors, those years, was still with her, but it was sitting differently. Not crushing, just present, acknowledged, real. The lobby doorman opened the door without a word, but his expression shifted in some way she didn't pause to analyze. The armored car waited outside. Dominic stood beside it, one hand in his pocket, jacket dark against the cold March air. He was watching the street when she came out, that habit he had of monitoring exits and approaches, threat assessment on autopilot. But he turned when he heard the door. He looked at her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Vivian, just her name, but something in the way he said it was different from every other time she'd ever heard it said. Don't, she told him quietly. Don't make this sentimental. A beat. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth that was almost a smile. Wouldn't dream of it. He opened the car door for her. She got in. He walked around to the other side and settled into the seat beside her, and the driver pulled away from the building without being told, because Dominic's people didn't need to be told. They simply watched and understood. The city moved past the windows in rivers of light. Vivian looked at the skyline she'd lived above for 12 years and felt, for the first time in longer than she could trace, something that was neither grief nor fear nor the particular exhaustion of survival. She felt like herself. She didn't know yet what that was going to cost her. The car turned south toward the Blackthorn, and the night opened up ahead of them. And somewhere on the other side of the city, Roman Vescari was stepping into a different car with Sienna Veil on his arm, not knowing, not yet, that the woman he'd dismissed in 3 flat sentences was on her way to the same room. And as the Manhattan skyline blazed around her and Dominic sat a careful 6 inches away and didn't touch her and didn't try to, Vivian pressed her fingers against the small, hard edge of the USB drive in her bag and felt it there. Insurance. Or a weapon. Depending on how the night went. The Blackthorn was 3 blocks away now. She could see its lit facade above the other buildings, the old stone glowing amber and white. Inside, 500 of the most powerful and dangerous people in New York were gathering for an evening they believed would be unremarkable. They had no idea what was about to walk through the door. The Blackthorn Foundation Gala occupied the entire ground floor and mezzanine of one of the oldest buildings in Lower Manhattan, a place that had been a bank once, then a courthouse, then nothing for 20 years before money decided it deserved to be beautiful again. The ceilings ran 40 feet overhead. The stone columns were original, limestone that had been standing since before anyone currently alive had drawn a first breath. Someone had strung 10,000 small lights through the upper scaffolding, and the effect was less like decoration and more like being inside something astronomical, something vast and cold and indifferent to the small human arrangements happening below it. Vivian felt it the moment she stepped through the doors. Not the grandeur. She'd been in rooms like this her entire adult life, and grandeur had long since stopped registering as anything other than a form of threat dressed in better lighting. What she felt was the shift. The specific atmospheric change that happened when a room full of dangerous people recalibrated their attention. It moved through the crowd like a current through water. Heads turned, not all at once. That wasn't how it worked in rooms like this, where looking too interested was its own kind of vulnerability. It happened in increments. A glance here, a pause there, a woman near the champagne service who'd been mid-sentence to her companion and simply stopped, her glass suspended between the tray and her lips. 2 men near the east column who tracked Vivian's entrance with the particular attention of people who spent their professional lives assessing exactly who had just walked into a room and why it mattered. Dominic stayed half a step behind her. That was deliberate. She knew it, and he knew she knew it. He was giving her the entrance, making clear to anyone watching that this was not his arrival. This was hers. She walked straight without hurrying. The dress moved the way it was built to move, and her heels on the marble made a sound she'd forgotten she was capable of making, clear and unhurried and absolutely certain of where they were going. A waiter materialized with a tray. She took a glass of water, not champagne. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that, the way you're grateful for small structural things when larger things are uncertain. Across the room, she hadn't found Roman yet. She would. She knew she would, the way you know where a fire is in a dark room before you can see it. By the heat. Costello, Dominic said quietly beside her. She didn't turn her head. Where? 8 o'clock. Talking to Ferrante's wife. Marco Costello. One of the 5 men who ran the Eastern Syndicate's financial oversight board. A man who had attended her wedding, who had sat at a table 15 feet from her for a decade's worth of events exactly like this one, and who had spoken to her perhaps 40 words total across that entire span of time because she was Roman's wife, and Roman's wife was furniture that occasionally required acknowledgement. He's staring, she said. They're all staring. I know. She took a small sip of water. Let them. She hadn't taken 4 more steps before the first approach came. Etta Dunmore. 60-something, broad shoulders, the kind of silver hair that cost a fortune to maintain at exactly that precise shade of authority. Her husband ran the Dunmore Group, which was the kind of financial institution that appeared in regulatory filings and almost never in newspapers. Etta herself was something separate from her husband's money. She'd built her own reputation in the city over 30 years, a reputation for knowing things, and for selecting, very carefully, who she chose to know. She had never once sought Vivian out at an event. Vivian, both hands extended, catching Vivian's free hand between them. A warm pressure. Genuine, or performing genuine well enough that it made no practical difference. You look extraordinary. Etta. Vivian let her hand stay where it was. You look well. I look like a woman who's been standing in heels for 40 minutes. A small, dry smile. But you're kind. The eyes, sharp, pale, always calculating, moved over Vivian's face with something that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite assessment but lived in the space between. I heard about the Moretti restructuring, the new international agreements. Vivian held the eye contact. Old business, nothing dramatic. Everything the Morettis do is dramatic, dear, even when they're trying very hard not to be. A beat. It's good to see you in the room tonight. She moved away before Vivian could respond to that, and Vivian understood that the comment was the entire point, not anything that had come before it. It's good to see you in the room, as opposed to absent, as opposed to the specific kind of absent that Roman had been building around her. Dominic was reading his phone, or appearing to. She knew he'd been listening. She knew, Vivian said quietly. Most of them knew, Dominic said, about Sienna, about the direction things were going. He slid the phone into his jacket pocket. They've been waiting to see what you'd do. And now they're seeing it. Now they're seeing it. She turned toward the room with her water glass at the level of her sternum and let herself look. Really look, the way she hadn't let herself look at events like this in years, because looking clearly had started to hurt in ways she couldn't afford. The room sorted itself into categories that she'd learned before she was 20. The ones with actual power, the ones performing power, the ones who serviced power and had learned to perform contentment about that arrangement, and then the very small number who occupied some category she'd never quite named. People who moved through rooms like this with the specific freedom of those who had, at some point, stopped needing anything from anyone in them. She had been in that last category once. She intended to be there again before the night was over. She found Roman. He was near the center of the room, which was Roman's natural habitat. He didn't work corners, didn't hover at edges. He occupied centers. He stood in a group of 4 other men, all of them in the orbit of his particular gravity, and he was talking with the ease of someone who had never spent 5 minutes worrying about what a room thought of him, because rooms thought what he told them to think. Sienna Vale was beside him. Vivian had seen photographs. The magazine covers Roman had mentioned, though the mention had been designed to wound, she understood that it had been precisely aimed. Sienna was 28, which Vivian registered without judgment and without pretending she didn't register it. She was tall, obviously, the kind of tall that made everything she wore look structural. Her gown was ivory with a deep back, and she stood beside Roman with her hand resting lightly in the crook of his arm, and her chin tilted at the specific angle of someone who had been told she was beautiful so consistently that she'd incorporated the information into her posture. She looked, Vivian thought, like a woman who believed she had won something. Roman turned his head. He found her across the room the same way she'd found him. Not searching, just suddenly knowing. Their eyes met over 40 feet of marble floor and 500 people who were pretending not to watch, and something moved across Roman Vescari's face that Vivian had not seen there in a long time. Uncertainty. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the mask came back, seamless, and he turned back to his conversation as though he hadn't seen her at all. But his shoulders had changed. She'd spent 12 years reading his shoulders. He wasn't expecting this, Dominic said beside her, low enough that only she could hear. No. She took a breath. He was expecting me to be upstairs in the dark. She watched Sienna notice the change in Roman and follow his previous line of sight and find nothing obvious to explain it, and then look back at Roman with that slight narrowing of attention that meant she was filing a question she hadn't decided yet whether to ask. Good, Vivian thought. Start asking questions. You'll find the answers educational. The next hour moved in layers. On the surface, it was exactly what these events always were. The choreographed social machinery of people who had too much and wanted more, and needed to spend several hours pretending that what they had was the result of merit and taste, rather than ruthlessness and geography. Speeches. A brief performance by a string quartet that no one listened to. The movement of waitstaff with trays through crowds that parted for trays, and not much else. Underneath that surface, something else was happening. Vivian moved through the room, and people came to her. Not all of them. Some held back, watching, which was its own kind of information. But enough. Enough that she could feel the shape of it, the reorientation happening in real time as the room processed her presence and ran its calculations. Vivian Moretti hadn't disappeared. Vivian Moretti was standing in the center of the Blackthorn Gala in a dress that cost more than discretion and looking at every person who approached her like she had always known they would come. She hadn't had a conversation like this in years. Not a real one. Not the kind where the other person was talking to her and not to the extension of Roman they'd needed her to be. Ferrante. Older. Careful. A man who had survived in their world long enough to develop the instincts of something almost geological, stopped beside her near the east windows and said without preamble, "The Moretti accounts in Geneva. They're still in your name." "They are," she said. "Roman knows this." "He does." She looked at him steadily. "He assumed I'd forgotten." Ferrante looked at her for a moment with something that might have been respect and might have been reassessment, and was probably both. "He makes that mistake about women," he said finally. "He makes it about everyone," Vivian said. "Women, he just makes it more." Ferrante almost smiled. "Your father would have been—" He stopped himself, nodded once. "It's good to see you, Vivian." She turned back to the room after he moved away and found Dominic at her shoulder. "How many of them knew about the Geneva accounts?" she asked. "The ones who matter?" "Most of them." He paused. "They've been watching those accounts, waiting to see whether they'd move." "They're going to move," she said. "A beat." "How much?" Dominic asked, and his voice was controlled, but she heard the thing underneath it. Not greed, nothing so simple, but the specific attention of someone recalibrating an understanding of the board. "Enough," she said. "That's all you need to know right now." He accepted that without pushing, which was one of the things she'd always respected about him. He knew which questions were his to ask and which ones weren't yet, and he didn't waste energy pressing on the ones that were closed. But things were not standing still across the room. She became aware of it first as a change in ambient pressure, the way certain crowded spaces shifted when a specific combination of people made contact they weren't supposed to make. She tracked it to a cluster near the bar. Roman had moved. He was no longer at the center of the room. He was standing near the north bar with two of his captains, Alonso and a man she recognized as Brescia, who ran logistics for the port operations, and the conversation was clearly not about the gala. Sienna was no longer beside him. Vivian scanned the room and found her near the east entrance, speaking with two women Vivian didn't recognize. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that required effort. "He pulled Alonso away from the Ferrante table," Dominic said quietly. 20 minutes ago." "Why?" "I don't know yet." A pause. "That's what concerns me." She looked at him. "What are your people saying?" The three of Roman's financial liaisons arrived in the last 40 minutes. None of them on the original guest list. He kept his voice completely even, which meant he was working to keep it that way. "Someone got them in through the service entrance." Vivian absorbed that, turned it over, looked at the configuration of the room again with new geometry. "He's not reacting to me," she said slowly. "He already had something planned for tonight. That's what I'm thinking. Something that doesn't have anything to do with Sienna or the divorce." She set her water glass down on the nearest surface. "He was already moving before I arrived. And now there are two things happening simultaneously," Dominic said, "which is worse than one thing." She almost said much worse. She didn't. Across the room, Roman finished whatever conversation he was having with Alonso and Brescia and looked up. Found her again. This time he didn't look away. He held the eye contact for 3 seconds, long in a room like this, where sustained eye contact across a crowd was its own form of declaration. And then he said something to Alonso, and Alonso nodded, and Roman began moving through the room toward her. "Here we go," Dominic said. "Stay where you are." She didn't look at him. "Don't move. Whatever he says." "Vivian." Dominic. A breath. "Please." He went still. Roman covered the distance between them with the ease of someone who had never moved through a room he didn't own, nodding at people as he passed, touching a shoulder here, accepting a brief handshake there, all of it automatic and fluid and masking the fact that his full attention was fixed on the woman standing in the black dress by the east windows. He stopped in front of her. Up close, she could see what the distance had hidden, a tightness around the eyes, the jaw set not with anger, not yet, but with something that was managing toward anger from another direction. He looked, she realized, like a man encountering something that wasn't going according to a calculation he'd already made. "You came," he said. "I was invited," she said, "by the foundation. My name's been on the donor list for 6 years. I know what you meant." She kept her voice low, conversational. She was not going to make a scene. She was not going to give him the scene. "Hello, Roman." His eyes moved to Dominic, stayed there for a moment, and she watched something pass through them that was not quite accusation and not quite understanding, but was working toward both. Then they came back to her. Don't." Her voice was quiet enough that it didn't carry past the two of them. "Don't tell me what I look like, not tonight." A muscle in his jaw. "We should talk." "We did talk. You talked. I listened. I thought that went very well for you." "Vivian." He stepped forward fractionally, and she held her ground. "What happened earlier? I could have." "You could have what?" Still quiet, still level. "Chosen a different way to do it?" "You're right. You could have." She looked at him steadily. "But you didn't, because the way you chose was honest, and I'd rather have had honest than whatever gentler version you might have constructed. So we're fine on that front." "You're not fine." "You don't know what I am," she said. "You stopped paying attention to what I am a long time ago. That's actually one of the central problems we're discussing." He looked at her, and she could see it working in him. The recalculation, the attempt to find the version of this conversation he knew how to manage, and not quite locating it, because the version of Vivian he'd been dealing with for the last several years would not be standing here saying these things in this particular tone. The version of Vivian he'd built his understanding around would be upstairs, or crying in a car, or calling her sister in Milan to say that things had fallen apart. She was not upstairs. She was not crying. "The attorneys," he said carefully, "we should coordinate before anything becomes already handled." She watched his expression shift. "I reached out this afternoon, before I came here actually, before we even spoke." She let that settle. "The Moretti contracts, Roman, the original partnership agreements from before our marriage. You remember those?" He remembered. She could see him remembering. The specific contracts that her father had insisted on. At the time, she'd thought her father was being sentimental, protective in that excessive way of his. Later, she'd realized he was being exactly what he'd always been, 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room. "Those contracts," Roman said slowly, "are 12 years old. 13, and they're binding." She tilted her head slightly. "I had a lot of time these past few years to be very quiet and very careful. Quiet people read things, Roman. They file things. They wait." Something changed in his face, not fear. Roman Vescari didn't do fear in any conventional way, but a recognition. The specific look of a man who has just understood that what he thought was a small problem has a different shape than he believed. "How much do you know?" he said. "Enough," she said, which was what she'd told Dominic, and it served the same purpose. Enough meaning everything, or nearly everything, or at the very least enough that the distinction between enough and everything became academic. Roman looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dominic. A look that had weight behind it, real weight, the kind that in their world carried specific implications. "You brought him here," Roman said. "I came with him," she said. "There's a difference." "There is not a difference." "Roman." She felt something settle in her, something that had been slightly displaced all evening, dropping back into its correct position. "We're in a room with 500 people. Behave accordingly." It was the wrong thing to say, or the right thing, depending on how you accounted for what happened next. Because Roman Vescari had many qualities, and most of them were genuinely dangerous. But what he did not have, what he had never been able to develop even in 30 years of operating at the highest levels of a world that required it, was the ability to absorb being spoken to that way by someone he'd already decided was beneath his attention. His expression didn't change much, but she felt the shift. The room felt the shift. Dominic felt it. She could tell by the way he straightened almost imperceptibly behind her. "We'll finish this tonight," Roman said quietly. "After." "We'll finish this on my timeline," she said, "not yours." He turned and walked back toward the bar. Not hurrying. That was Roman. He never hurried, not visibly, because visibly hurrying was the same as visibly losing ground. But she watched his path, and she saw him take his phone out before he'd gone 10 steps. And she watched his thumb move, and she knew he was communicating with someone, and she did not know who. "That was—" Dominic started. "I know," she said. "He's going to—" "I know." She reached back and took her water glass again and took a breath that she didn't let show. "He had something running before I got here. The financial men who came in the service entrance. I have someone looking. Tell them to look faster." 20 minutes passed. They were the longest 20 minutes she could remember in recent history, and her recent history included some considerable competition for that title. She moved. She spoke to people. She smiled when smiling was required and listened when listening served better, and she did all of it while a separate part of her mind ran the calculations she'd been building for 3 years and tried to find the variable she was missing. Sienna reappeared near Roman. She moved to his side and tucked against him with a practiced ease that Vivian recognized, not because she'd ever been that version, but because she'd watched other women be it at events like this, and she knew what it meant. It meant Sienna knew something was wrong and was staking her position against the wrongness. It was a survival move, dressed up as affection. Then Dominic's phone moved in his jacket. He looked at it. 1 second, 2. His face told her nothing, which meant it was bad. "Tell me," she said. "The 3 men Roman brought in tonight." He kept his eyes on the room. "They're not financial liaisons." "Then what are they?" "2 of them work for Caruso." A pause that was not long enough and contained too much. "The 3rd man I can't confirm yet, but his name is Reyes, and he was in Buenos Aires 18 months ago when the Moretti port contracts were renegotiated." Vivian was very still. Caruso. Eduardo Caruso, who ran the Southern Network, who had been in a Cold War with the Moretti family for 15 years over the South American distribution channels, who had twice in that span of time approached Roman about a strategic realignment that would involve, among other things, the dissolution of the Moretti Vescari partnership agreements, the ones she'd just told Roman she had. "He's making a move tonight," she said. The words came out level because she made them level. "This wasn't about me. The divorce. It wasn't only about me." "No," Dominic said. "I think—" He stopped. "Say it." "I think announcing the divorce was the first step in a repositioning." He turned slightly toward her, just enough to keep the conversation private without looking private. If he cuts the Moretti connection publicly, marriage dissolves, contracts voided, the argument being that the Moretti-Vescari partnership was personal, not structural. Then the Caruso alignment has room to operate without the legacy Moretti obligations blocking it. Vivian said nothing. Because what he was describing was elegant, actually. She could see the shape of it. She could see her father's framework being dismantled from the inside, piece by piece. And she could see that Roman had been building toward this not for weeks, but for longer than that. And she could see that she herself had been a component in the architecture of it. Not an obstacle, not even a person. Just a link in a chain that he needed to sever cleanly. The clarity of it was almost breathtaking. "He doesn't know about the USB drive," she said. "No." "And he doesn't know I spoke to Ferrante tonight." "No?" "Good." She turned toward the room, found Roman across it, found the particular angle of his shoulders, The way he was standing with Sienna beside him and Alonzo behind him, and the two Caruso men positioned at the bar like they'd been there all evening. All of it clicking into its true shape now that she was looking at it from the correct angle. She became aware, in the same moment, that she was not afraid. She'd expected to be when it came down to it. She'd prepared for the fear, had strategies for managing it, had run the mental rehearsals. But standing in the middle of the Blackthorn Gala with the full understanding of what she was inside and what she was up against, and what tonight was actually about, the dominant thing she felt was not fear. It was clarity. Terrible, clean, arrived too late, and right on time clarity. "Dominic," she said, "I'm here." "When I walk to that side of the room," she said, "I need you to make sure Ferrante sees it." A pause. "That's going to... I know what it's going to do." She straightened the line of her dress with one small movement. "That's why I need Ferrante to see it." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking beside her, not hesitating, not afraid, just moving through the same calculations she was moving through and arriving at the same destination from a different direction. "If you do this," he said, "there's no version of tonight where things go back to where they were this morning." "Things weren't acceptable where they were this morning," she said. "I know, I mean for you, personally." His voice dropped further. "Roman will treat this as a declaration." "It is a declaration." The air between them held that for a moment. "All right," Dominic said. She took one breath. She set her water glass down on the nearest surface. And Vivian Moretti walked across the floor of the Blackthorn Gala toward the most dangerous man in the room. Not her husband, but Eduardo Caruso's representative, standing at the north bar with a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched. And the entire room watched her do it, and Roman Vescari's head turned like something pulled by a wire. And she saw on his face, across 40 feet of limestone and candlelight, the precise moment he understood that she hadn't calculated for. That was the sentence finishing itself in Roman's expression. Not rage, not the cold, controlled fury she knew how to read and navigate and survive, but something rawer than that. The look of a man watching a board game tip over. All the pieces suddenly loose. All the positions he'd spent months arranging sliding into new configurations that he hadn't mapped. Vivian didn't stop walking. The man at the North Bar was named Reyes, and she knew this only from what Dominic had told her 4 minutes ago, and she knew almost nothing else about him except that he had been in Buenos Aires when the Moretti port contracts were renegotiated, and that he was standing here tonight not as a guest, but as a signal. A marker placed on a board by someone who wasn't in the room. She covered the distance in 12 steps. He saw her coming at step 8. She watched his posture change. Not defensively, not with alarm, but with the recalibration of someone who'd been waiting for something to happen and was now uncertain whether this was it. He was perhaps 50, compact, with the kind of stillness that came from professional practice rather than natural temperament. He held his bourbon glass loosely. He did not drink from it. She stopped in front of him. "You're Reyes," she said. A beat. "I'm sorry?" "You were in Buenos Aires in March of last year." She kept her voice conversational, kept her face neutral. "The Moretti renegotiation, you were in the room." His expression didn't break, but something behind it shifted, some internal adjustment. "I think you have me confused with..." "I don't," she said. "I have a very good memory for faces. My father taught me that. He said a room full of faces is a room full of information, and you should read everyone." She tilted her head slightly. He was right, as it turns out. Reyes looked at her for a moment. Then he put his bourbon glass down on the bar surface, with a deliberateness that felt like a small decision being made. "Mrs. Vescari," he said. "Moretti," she said. "Tonight, it's Moretti." Something flickered. "Of course. I'd like you to tell Eduardo Caruso something for me." She watched his face register the name and held back the satisfaction of it, confirmed, without his saying anything, the connection she'd needed confirmed. "Tell him that the Moretti-Vescari partnership agreements contain a joint liability clause that survives dissolution of the primary marriage contract. Tell him his attorneys may have missed it because it's embedded in an annex that was added to the original documents 11 months after signing, when my father realized Roman's people were sloppy readers." She paused. Tell him that if the Caruso realignment moves forward on the current framework, that clause becomes a direct encumbrance on every port operation Caruso runs through the eastern channels. Tell him I'm available to discuss alternatives. Reyes was very still. Tell him, she finished, that Vivian Moretti says hello. She turned away from the bar before he could respond, which was the only way to play it. The turn was the statement. The turn said that she didn't need his response. She only needed him to carry the message. And she walked back into the room with her spine straight and her breathing deliberately slow and her mind running so fast behind her eyes that the room around her had taken on a slightly unreal quality. The way things went slightly unreal when you were operating very close to the edge of what you'd prepared for. Dominic was exactly where she'd left him. He looked at her face when she reached him, and he didn't ask whether it had worked. He could see from her face that it had worked, or had worked as much as it was going to, which wasn't the same as having solved anything, but was enough to change the shape of the night. Ferrante saw, he said. Good. 3 other people I can name also saw. The word will move before midnight. That's the intention. She picked up a champagne flute from a passing tray, her first of the night, and she needed it not for the alcohol, but for something to hold, something her hands could do. Where's Roman now? Dominic's eyes moved across the room. East corridor. He went through the side door about 90 seconds ago. With Alonzo? With Alonzo and Brescia both. That was 3 people absent from the main room simultaneously. In a social context that had specific rules about visibility, 3 people disappearing at once was not an accident and was not a bathroom break. It was a meeting. Who else went with them? She said. That's the thing. Dominic kept his voice absolutely flat. Nobody. Just the 3 of them. She processed that. Not the Caruso men. No. The Caruso men are still at the bar. A pause. Which means Roman pulled away from his own people to talk to his own people. Separately. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant that Roman would separate himself from the evening specifically after she'd made her move to Reyes, whether he'd seen her approach the bar, whether Alonzo had told him, whether the meeting happening right now in the East Corridor was reactive, a response to her, or whether it had been scheduled and her move to Reyes had simply accelerated the timeline. I need to know what they're saying, she said. I know. Dominic's jaw shifted slightly. Working on it. She stood in the glittering chaos of the gala and drank half the champagne without tasting it and tried to hold steady inside the awareness that she was playing several things simultaneously and that she did not have complete information about any of them, and that incomplete information was the condition under which catastrophic errors were made. Her father had told her that too. You will never have complete information. Make your best decisions with what you have and build in margins for what you don't. She was very deep into the margins right now. It was Sienna who found her. That was not something she'd anticipated. Sienna Vale crossing the room in her ivory gown with that carefully maintained expression and stopping in front of Vivian Moretti, that was not in any version of tonight she'd run in her head. But here the woman was, and she had the look of someone who had made a decision about something and was executing it before they could change their mind. Mrs. Vescari, Sienna said. Ms. Vale. Vivian kept her voice even. I hope you're enjoying the evening. A beep. Something worked behind Sienna's eyes. She was not stupid, Vivian registered. She had the look of someone who had been underestimated long enough to develop a very specific relationship with being underestimated. I'd like to speak with you, if that's possible. Dominic shifted beside her. Vivian touched his arm once, lightly, which meant stay. Of course, Vivian said. They moved to a quieter section near the north windows, where the crowd thinned and the ambient noise of the room dropped to something manageable. Sienna stood with her hands together in front of her, fingers interlaced, and she looked at Vivian directly, which took something, Vivian acknowledged. It took something to look directly at the wife of the man you were involved with, in a room full of that man's world. I didn't know, Sienna said, about what he said to you. Tonight, before the gala. Vivian said nothing. Let the silence work. I found out because Alonzo told one of his people, and that person told someone who told me. A breath. I want you to know I didn't know he was going to do it that way. What way did you think he was going to do it? Sienna's jaw moved. He told me the marriage had been over for years, that it was a formal arrangement at this point, that you'd discussed it and both agreed that… She stopped herself, looked briefly at the floor, then back. I'm not naive. I know what the story was. I want to say I didn't know the version that was real. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. 28 years old, she thought again. 28 years old and already learning which versions of things were real. That was either very good or very sad, and possibly both. He's very good at versions, Vivian said finally. Yes. Sienna's voice was quieter now. I'm starting to understand that. How long? Almost a year. A pause. But the last 3 months have felt different, like something shifted, like he needed me to be somewhere specific for reasons that weren't about me. Her hands unlaced and then relaced, a small repeated motion she probably didn't know she was doing. He asked me to wear this dress tonight, specifically this dress. He said it photographed well. Vivian absorbed that. He wanted you documented, on his arm, tonight specifically. I think so. Something moved across Sienna's face. Not tears, but the place adjacent to where tears live. I think I've been a prop in something I don't fully understand. Welcome, Vivian thought. Welcome to the version that is real. She didn't say that. What she said was, go home tonight. Take the car he sent for you and go directly home and don't make any statements to anyone. Do you understand? Sienna looked at her. Why are you… Because whatever is happening tonight in this room is going to generate consequences that will move through several people's lives for a long time. Vivian kept her voice steady and low. And you have the option of being outside most of those consequences if you remove yourself now. That option will not be available later. A long moment. Okay, Sienna said. She walked away toward the cloakroom without looking back. Vivian watched her go and felt something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite recognition, but lived somewhere between them. Then she turned back to find Dominic at her shoulder with his phone in his hand and an expression she'd never seen on him before. What? She said. My contact in the East Corridor. He looked at her. I need you to stay very calm. Her stomach dropped. Tell me. Brescia, he said. Brescia is Caruso's man. Has been for 14 months. The room kept going around her. The string quartet was playing again. A waiter passed with a tray of salmon canapes. Someone laughed near the center of the room, a bright social sound that bounced off the limestone columns and dissolved. Brescia, she said. He's been feeding Caruso's people operational information since before the Buenos Aires renegotiation. Dominic's voice was under very tight control. The renegotiation itself, Caruso knew the Moretti position going in. He knew the floor you were willing to accept. He knew which clauses your attorneys were prepared to concede. She felt the cold moving through her from the inside. Not the cold of the room. The air conditioning was set exactly right. It always was in places like this. But the specific cold of understanding arriving in a form worse than you'd prepared for. That's why the terms were so poor, she said. Her own voice sounded distant to her. We thought we'd miscalculated. We thought the Caruso team was simply better prepared, but they had our numbers. They had everything. A pause. Vivian, the annex clause, the joint liability clause you used at the bar tonight. She looked at him. If Brescia's been feeding them information for 14 months, Dominic said carefully, Caruso's people may already know about the clause. They may have already found a workaround. The room kept being the room. The lights kept being the lights. She had walked to that bar and laid down what she believed was her strongest card, and she had watched Reyes's face register it with the specific attention of someone hearing something that mattered, and she had read that as confirmation, as proof that the clause was news, as leverage. But confirmation could look like many things. Attention could mean you're hearing something new, or it could mean you're watching someone play a card you've already neutralized. I need to know, she said. I know. I need to know right now whether Caruso has a workaround for that clause. I'm working on… Dominic. Her voice came out sharper than she intended, and she pulled it back. I need to know because if they do, If Roman has already signed something with Caruso that addresses the liability clause, then I have nothing. The USB drive has the Moretti financial documentation, but without the joint liability clause as leverage, the documentation is defensive at best. It protects me personally. It doesn't stop the realignment. She felt herself thinking out loud and couldn't stop it, didn't want to stop it, needed the words in the air to see them clearly. And if the realignment goes through tonight, it can't go through tonight. It's a gala. You can't. Roman doesn't finalize things at appropriate moments, she said. He finalizes things when other people think he won't. That's been his method for 30 years. She looked across the room toward the east corridor door, still closed. He's been in there for 12 minutes. That's not a conversation. That's a signing. Dominic looked at the door. If he's signing with Caruso's representative tonight, she said slowly, then Brescia is in that room. And if Brescia is in that room, it's not just Roman and Alonso. It's Roman, Alonso, Brescia as the Caruso proxy, and whatever document they've had prepared. She felt something going very quiet inside her, the specific quiet of absolute necessity. How long has your contact been watching the corridor? Since they went in. Has anyone else gone through that door? A pause. One person, 20 minutes ago, before you went to the bar. Who? Dominic looked at her, and the look on his face told her before his mouth did. She watched his jaw set. Watched him decide to say it because not saying it was worse. Ferrante, he said. The word landed in her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. The ripples moved outward in every direction and kept moving. Ferrante, who had sought her out tonight, who had mentioned the Geneva accounts, who had looked at her with something she'd read as respect and reassessment, and had filed away as an ally. Not an ally, not even a neutral, but someone who was watching and hadn't chosen a side yet and might be persuaded. It's good to see you in the room tonight. Not support. Not welcome. Reconnaissance. Ferrante had talked to her to find out what she knew and what she had and what her position was, and then he had walked through a door 20 minutes ago to report to the people on the other side of it. And she had told him about the Geneva accounts. She had told him the accounts would move. She had, in the specific language she'd used, told him she intended to leverage the Moretti financial position against whatever Roman had planned. And 20 minutes later, Reyes at the bar had listened to her describe the joint liability clause with the expression of a man who already knew what she was saying, because he had known, because Ferrante had told them. She stood in the middle of the Blackthorn Gala and understood, with a clarity that felt like being struck, that she had walked into tonight believing she was the person who knew more than the room knew, and she had been wrong. She had been wrong in a way that had used her own confidence against her, had let her read the evening as confirmation of what she'd prepared when it was, in fact, something else entirely. A room that had been arranged around her. Information she'd been allowed to provide. A performance she'd believed she was directing that had been directed at her. Her father's voice in her head, so clear it almost had physical presence. The most dangerous moment is when you think you understand the board. Roman knows about the USB drive, she said. The words came out very quiet. Dominic went still. He has to. She was working through it even as she said it, and she hated the process, hated feeling the structure of what she'd believed collapsing piece by piece into its true shape. Ferrante knew about the Geneva accounts within minutes of me telling him. That information went straight through that door. If Ferrante was gathering information all evening, if this was organized, if Roman set it up so that people would approach me and I would tell them what I had. She stopped. The dressing room. The vault. Roman doesn't know about the vault. He doesn't know about the vault, she said. But if he had the dressing room monitored... I swept that room 6 weeks ago. Dominic's voice was sharp with something. I sweep it every month. There's nothing in that room. She looked at him. Vivian. His jaw was tight. I have swept that room every month for 2 years because I knew things were moving in a direction and I wanted to make sure you had secure space. There's nothing in that room. She heard what he'd said and heard also the thing beneath it, that he had been doing that for 2 years, quietly, without telling her, which meant he'd been watching the same erosion she'd been living inside and had prepared for it in the ways available to him. She put that somewhere it deserved to go, somewhere she could return to when the present crisis had some resolution and refocused. He doesn't have the USB drive, she said. No. But he may have documentation of the accounts. If Ferrante, the Geneva accounts are in your name, Roman can't touch them regardless of what Ferrante told him. He can challenge them. Yes. A pause. He can challenge them. She turned to look toward the east corridor door, still closed, and she thought about what was happening on the other side of it with a precision that felt like surgery on herself, cutting carefully through what she'd believed to find what was actually there. Ferrante's defection meant the liability clause was compromised. It meant Caruso's people had been given time to consult their attorneys and determine whether the clause was truly binding or whether the restructuring framework Roman had been building for months had already, somewhere in its foundations, addressed it. The USB drive remained. 3 years of financial documentation, asset mapping, transfer records, things Roman didn't know she had because he hadn't believed she was paying attention. He had been wrong about that. But wrong wasn't enough if the liability clause was gone. What she had left was documentation that could protect her personally, that could ensure the divorce settlement fell in her favor, that could prevent Roman from constructing a narrative in which she'd contributed nothing and deserved nothing and had signed away the Moretti legacy at the altar without understanding what she was doing. What she did not have, what she may have lost in the last 40 minutes without knowing she was losing it, was the ability to stop the Caruso realignment. And if that realignment went through, if Roman dissolved the Moretti Vescari partnership agreements under the new Caruso framework, then the East Coast operation her father had spent 40 years building would be folded into an organization that had spent 15 years trying to destroy it. That was what tonight was about. Not the divorce. Not Sienna. Those were the surface. The real thing was below. The door to the East Corridor opened. Alonso came out first, then Brescia, who did not look toward her and did not look toward Dominic, whose studied neutrality of expression was itself a form of confirmation. Then Roman. Roman came through the door and buttoned his jacket and looked across the room and found her face, and she looked back at him, and they held each other's gaze across the floor of the Blackthorn, and she saw it then, finally, completely. Saw that he had won whatever had just happened in that room, that whatever he'd gone in there to accomplish had been accomplished, and that he was looking at her now with something that was not cruelty, but was adjacent to it, the specific expression of a man who believed he had just removed the last obstacle. He believed, she realized, that she didn't know. He believed she'd played her hand at the bar, and he'd watched it fail, and she didn't know it had failed, and he was about to walk back across this room, and he intended to... Her phone moved in her bag. She reached in. Unknown number. But the message was 4 words. Check the north exit. She stared at the message. Dominic, she said. I see it. He was looking at his own phone. Who sent? I don't know. His voice had changed quality. But I'm getting the same thing. Different phrasing. North exit. Now. She looked toward the north exit. The large pair doors at the far end of the room that opened to the side street entrance, which was the quieter entrance, the one the Gala's operational staff used, the one without press. Through the glass panels beside the doors, she could see the street beyond. And standing on the sidewalk outside, coat on, no Gala credentials, looking directly through the glass at her, was a woman she had not seen in 9 years. Her hands went cold, because the woman standing on that sidewalk was Lucia Ferrante, Marco Ferrante's daughter, who had disappeared from New York 9 years ago under circumstances that had never been fully explained. A voluntary departure, the family had said. A need for distance. Everyone in their world had accepted that explanation the way you accepted explanations that came from powerful families about inconvenient things, which was to say you accepted them publicly and believed almost none of them privately. Vivian had believed this one because she'd had no reason not to. But Lucia Ferrante was standing on a sidewalk in Manhattan in March, looking directly at Vivian through glass with an expression that had so much in it, urgency and fear, and something else, something Vivian couldn't name from this distance. And Vivian understood suddenly, and with absolute certainty, that whatever she'd thought she knew about tonight, about Ferrante, about the shape of the board she was playing on, there was something underneath it she had not reached yet. something that Lucia Ferrante had crossed 9 years and however many miles to deliver. She looked at Dominic. He was already moving. She followed him through the crowd, through the north end of the room, past the string quartet who were playing something she couldn't identify, and through the cluster of people near the cloakroom, and the whole time the back of her neck was sending signals she'd learned a long time ago not to ignore. The specific prickling awareness of being watched, of movement happening behind her that was tracking her movement, of the room behind her shifting in the way rooms shifted when something had been set in motion. Dominic pushed the north door open. Cold air. The street smell of March in Manhattan, concrete and cold water, and exhaust, and the specific mineral smell of a city that had been standing in rain. The noise of the Gala dropped behind them, and the city's ambient sound replaced it. Lucia Ferrante was 12 feet away. She was 40, or close to it. Dark coat. No jewelry. The kind of absence of jewelry that in their world was itself a statement. She was not presenting herself as a member of the Ferrante family tonight. She was presenting herself as something separate from that. Her eyes went to Dominic and then back to Vivian. "How much time do we have?" she said. Her voice was lower than Vivian remembered, more careful. "I don't know," Vivian said. "Why are you here?" "Because my father doesn't know I am." A breath of cold air moved between them. "And if he knew, tonight would end very differently for you." Vivian held very still. "My father has been working with Caruso for 2 years, Lucia said. "Not 14 months. 2 years. Everything you think happened at the Buenos Aires renegotiation. The leak, the bad terms, the Moretti position being compromised." She paused, something moving in her jaw. "That wasn't Brescia. Brescia came later. The original source was my father." The cold air on Vivian's face, the sound of the city, the light through the glass doors behind her where 500 people were unaware of this sidewalk. "He gave Caruso the Moretti position," she said. "He gave Caruso everything, the accounts, the clause structure. The annex you used tonight." Lucia's voice dropped further. "Vivian, Caruso's attorneys have had the annex for 22 months. They filed a preemptive interpretation challenge with 3 different jurisdictions in November. The liability clause you're counting on—" She stopped. "Say it," Vivian said. "It was invalidated by a Cayman arbitration panel in January," Lucia said. 6 weeks ago. My father got confirmation 6 weeks ago, and he has been waiting for you to play it, tonight, in this room, in front of witnesses." Her eyes were very steady and very serious, and carrying the specific weight of someone who had decided that what they were doing was right and was terrified it was too late. "If you walk back into that room and press the liability clause as leverage, Roman's attorneys will produce the arbitration ruling in front of everyone present, in front of Ferrante and Castellano and every captain watching tonight to decide which direction to move." She paused. "It won't just kill the clause. It will make you look like you didn't know. Like you came in here tonight with an empty hand and pretended it was full. And in this world, Vivian, that's not a setback." The city moved around them. A cab went past. Someone on the far end of the block was walking a dog. Normal things happening in the cold March air, indifferent and ongoing. "That's the end of your credibility," Lucia Ferrante said. "Permanently. With everyone watching." Vivian stood on the sidewalk outside the Blackthorn Foundation Gala and felt the ground she'd been standing on complete its final shift beneath her. And the thing she felt was not the collapse she would have expected. Not despair, not the specific falling sensation of a plan coming apart, but something stranger and colder, and in some ways worse. Because somewhere underneath the ruin of what she'd built, and the structure of what she'd believed, and the careful years of preparation that had just been hollowed out from beneath her, something else was waking up. Something that had been waiting a long time for exactly this, for there to be nothing left to protect, nothing left to manage carefully, nothing left to lose. The ivory ghost. Not the woman Roman had married, not the woman who had made herself small enough to survive beside him. The one underneath all of that. The one her father had built, and her father had feared, and her father had loved in the specific fearful way you loved something you knew was more dangerous than you intended it to become. She looked at Lucia Ferrante. "How did you get here?" she said. "Flew in this morning." "Who knows you're in the city?" "No one." You're certain? Yes. What do you want? Vivian said. For this? For coming here? What do you need from me? Lucia looked at her for a moment, and then she said the one thing Vivian hadn't prepared for, the thing that changed the entire shape of what came next, the thing that made Vivian close her eyes for exactly 2 seconds before opening them again with the specific expression of a woman who had just understood what game she was actually playing and had decided in those 2 seconds to, my daughter, Lucia said. She's 9 years old. She was born 8 months after I left New York. A breath that came out unsteady at the edges despite everything. Roman knows about her. He's known for 3 years. He's been using that information to keep my father compliant. Her jaw tightened against something. My father didn't betray the Morettis because he wanted to. He did it because Roman told him that if the Caruso realignment didn't go through, if the partnership agreements held, he would make sure certain people knew where my daughter lives. The city kept going around them. Vivian opened her eyes. Your daughter's name, she said. Elena. Where is she now? Safe. Tonight she's safe. She's with someone I trust, but after tonight, Lucia stopped. The control in her voice was extraordinary given everything it was containing. If Roman wins what he's building in that room, he doesn't need my father anymore. And if he doesn't need my father, the thing protecting Elena disappears. Vivian looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then she said, Come with me. She pushed back through the north doors. The warmth of the Gala hit her like a physical thing. The light, the noise, the compressed air of 500 people in formal wear pretending the world was elegant. She moved through it differently now. Not the controlled, measured movement of a woman executing a plan. Something faster. Something that didn't bother with the performance layer because the performance layer had just become a liability. Dominic was 2 steps behind her and then beside her, matching her pace without being told. Talk to me, he said. The liability clause is dead. Arbitration ruling, January Cayman panel. Caruso has had it for 6 weeks. She kept her voice below the ambient noise. Ferrante's been running Caruso's intelligence operation for 2 years, not Brescia. Brescia was secondary. The whole Buenos Aires failure was Ferrante. Christ. Barely a breath. The plan to expose the clause in front of witnesses tonight, that was the trap. They wanted me to play it publicly so they could invalidate it publicly, destroy the credibility along with the leverage. She scanned the room as she moved, found Roman near the center, found Alonso, found the 2 Caruso men at the bar, who were no longer pretending to be casual. How many people in this room are Romans? Loyal? Truly loyal. Dominic didn't hesitate. Fewer than he thinks, more than you'd want. Security detail. 4 on the floor, 2 outside. Caruso's people. Reyes and the man at the bar. Possibly 1 more I haven't confirmed. Ferrante. She found him across the room, standing near the east column where he'd been most of the evening, and she looked at the man who had sat across from her 40 minutes ago and asked about the Geneva accounts with the specific gentleness of someone gathering intelligence, and she felt the anger move through her clean and cold and completely without the blurring effect that hot anger had. This was the cold kind, the kind that was useful. What do we have? She said. Actually have, not what I thought we had. The USB drive. Dominic's voice was stripped to essentials. The Geneva accounts in your name. The documentation of asset transfers over the past 6 years. Things Roman moved without your signature that technically required your signature under the original partnership structure. A pause. And Lucia Ferrante. Lucia Ferrante is not a legal instrument. No. But she's Marco Ferrante's daughter, and she's standing 20 feet inside this room right now, and her father doesn't know it. He looked at her sideways. In front of the right audience, that's something. Vivian stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the Blackthorn Gala and let herself be completely still for 4 seconds, which was all she could afford, and she ran the board. The real board. Not the one she'd come in with, not the one she'd built over 3 years of careful preparation, but the one that actually existed right now in this room tonight with these pieces. The liability clause was gone. That was gone. The USB drive held documentation of asset transfers that violated the partnership agreement's signature requirements. In a legal proceeding, over time, with the right attorneys, That documentation could be devastating, but legal proceedings took years and required a functioning position to fight from, and Roman intended to eliminate her position tonight. Ferrante's exposure, the fact that he'd been running Caruso's intelligence for 2 years, was information that mattered to specific people in this room. People who had believed Ferrante was neutral, people who had trusted him as a voice of stability in the syndicate's financial oversight structure. If those people understood what he'd done, what he'd allowed Caruso to do to the Moretti infrastructure, some of them would move. Maybe enough. Elena Ferrante, 9 years old, existing as leverage in Roman's hands without anyone in this room knowing it. And Marco Ferrante, standing by the east column, who had been protecting his daughter by destroying everything Vivian had built, and who did not yet know his daughter was 20 feet away. 4 seconds. Then, I need to speak to Roman. Alone. Dominic's whole body registered the objection before he said it. Vivian, not to negotiate. She looked at him directly. To give him one chance to stop this himself. Witnessed. She watched him process that. Because when he refuses, and he will refuse, I want people in this room to have seen me give him the chance. A beat. You want it on record that you tried. I want it on record that he chose. Dominic looked across the room at Roman, looked back at her, looked at something in her face that she wasn't hiding anymore, and probably hadn't been hiding for the last 10 minutes because there wasn't time for that now. Stay in the center of the room, he said, visible from every angle. Obviously. If Alonso moves, I move. Agreed. She straightened, rolled her shoulders back once, a small private motion, something for herself. The dress was exactly what it had been an hour ago, the dark silver embroidery, the fabric with its specific weight and intention. She'd forgotten it was on her body for the last 20 minutes, and now she felt it again and was glad of it. Armor functioned whether or not you were thinking about it. She walked toward Roman, the crowd parted. Not dramatically. It wasn't a movie moment. It wasn't people stepping aside with awareness. It was the natural movement of bodies registering approach and adjusting. The small, unconscious choreography of rooms full of people who'd spent their lives reading physical intention. She moved like she was going somewhere, and they accommodated it. Roman saw her coming at the same distance Reyes had. Earlier. A lifetime ago. He said something to the man beside him, not Alonso, one of the financial men she didn't recognize. And the man moved away, and Roman stood in the center of the room and waited for her with his hands loose at his sides and the expression of someone who had been expecting this and had prepared for it. She stopped close enough to be clearly in conversation and too far for it to look intimate. Roman, she said. Vivian. His voice was what it always was, controlled, slightly flat, the voice of a man who had decided tone was something other people used. You've had a busy evening. We need to talk. We're talking. About what you signed in the East Corridor. A fractional pause, less than a second. She'd been watching for it. I don't know what you're referring to. Roman. She kept her voice very level. I'm not going to pretend I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend you don't know I know. We're past that. Both of us. She held his gaze. Walk this back tonight. Whatever you signed, whatever framework you've built with Caruso, tell them it needs more time. Tell them the attorneys found a problem. Tell them anything. She paused. I'm asking you to stop. Something moved through his face. Not guilt. She wasn't looking for guilt, and she didn't find it. Something more like assessment. The look of a man hearing a proposition and running its value. You don't have the clause, he said quietly. She didn't react. Came in panel, he said. January 14th, unanimous ruling. He studied her face. You didn't know until tonight. What I know and when I knew it, she said, isn't the conversation I'm trying to have. Then what conversation are you trying to have? The one where I tell you that what you've built with Caruso has a foundation problem you don't know about yet, and that if you move forward tonight, you are going to spend the next several years discovering the shape of that problem in the worst possible way. She watched his face. I'm telling you there's something in this room tonight that you did not put here and that you don't control, and I am asking you, once, Roman. I am asking you once. To stop and let us speak privately before you decide you've already won." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she could hear the ambient noise of the room, the string quartet between pieces, someone's laughter from across the space, the structural breathing of 500 people in an enclosed space. Then he said, "You have nothing." She felt it land, the specific flatness of it, the complete indifference. "You came in here tonight with one card and it was already pulled from the deck," he said. "Ferrante told me about the Geneva accounts. I've already spoken to counsel about the signature violations on the transfers. They'll argue duress and administrative error and they'll win, Vivian, because they always win because I pay them enough to always win." He said it without cruelty. That was Roman. The absence of cruelty was sometimes more devastating than the presence of it, because it meant he didn't consider her worth the energy. "Go home. Take the settlement. It's a good settlement. Better than you'd get if we fight." She held his gaze. "Lucia Ferrante is in this room," she said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd heard all night. She watched it hit him. Watched the calculation he'd been running, smooth, controlled, already complete in his head, stutter, just for a second, a quarter second. But she'd been watching his face for 12 years and she saw it. "That's not possible," he said. "She's standing near the north windows." Vivian didn't point, didn't look, kept her eyes on Roman's face with the specific steadiness of someone who has just played the only card they have left and needs to watch how it lands. "She flew in this morning. She came because she wanted me to know what you've been holding over her father, what you've been using to keep Marco in line." Roman's jaw set. "A 9-year-old girl," Vivian said. Her voice didn't shake. She wouldn't let it shake. "Roman, don't." His voice had changed, still controlled but with something underneath it now that wasn't quite comfortable in its containment. "Don't make this into something it—" "What is it then?" she said. "Tell me what it is." He didn't answer. "Because from where I'm standing," she said, "it's a child. And everyone in this room who knows what you've been doing with information about that child is going to need to decide what they think about that. All of Ferrante's credibility with the Financial Oversight Board, all of the syndicate backing that's been sitting behind the Caruso realignment, it's built on a man who's been operating under duress for 2 years. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "That's not a stable foundation, Roman, and the people in this room who understand foundations are about to understand that." His expression had gone very still. Still in the way it went still when something was happening behind it that he wasn't ready to surface. "You don't want to do this here," he said. "I don't want to do any of this anywhere," she said. "But here we are." She turned away from him. She crossed the room toward the east column, and she didn't look back because looking back was for people who weren't certain, and she needed to be certain right now in her body and her bearing and the specific rhythm of her heels on the marble. She needed every person watching to see certainty. Ferrante was still at the column. He saw her coming, and something happened in his face. Surprise, and then something much older than surprise. Something she recognized from the faces of people who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been told that someone else knew what they were carrying. She stopped in front of him. "Your daughter is here," she said, quietly, just between them. "Lucia is in this room tonight." Marco Ferrante made a sound, small, involuntary, almost nothing, but it was the most real thing she'd heard from him all evening. "She's safe," Vivian said. "She flew in to tell me what you've been doing and why. I know about Elena, Marco. I know what Roman's been holding." She watched the old man's face work through something enormous. "I'm not angry with you. I need you to understand that. I know why you did what you did, and I am not angry." She paused. "But I need you to do something tonight that requires more of you than what Roman's been asking, and I need you to decide right now." His eyes were wet. She registered that with something that wasn't detached. She wasn't detached. She was very much present and feeling all of it, the weight and the specific sadness of a man in his 70s who'd been broken by something he never should have been put against. But she couldn't give that the space it deserved right now. "What do you need?" Ferrante said. His voice was rough. "When I move to the center of this room," she said, "I need you to stand up and tell the truth about Caruso, about the 2 years, about what you were given and what was taken from you in return. She held his gaze. In front of everyone. The financial board, the captains, all of them. Everything you told Caruso's people, you tell this room. Roman is going to have enough to manage in the next 10 minutes that he won't have resources left over for you. She said it with more certainty than she had a right to. And she said it that way deliberately because certainty was the only currency that would work with a frightened man in the next 30 seconds. I'm going to make sure of that. Ferrante looked at her. Long. She could see him measuring something. Not her trustworthiness, she thought, but his own capacity. Whether there was still enough of him, after 2 years of this, to do the thing she was asking. Then he nodded. One small, ancient, exhausted nod. She moved. She went first to Dominic. 12 seconds. She told him what she needed and watched his face process it, and watched him move immediately. No questions, no hesitation, which was, she noted distantly, one of the things she'd built her understanding of him on across years of watching him work, and which was now, tonight, something she was building something else on entirely. Then she found Lucia near the north windows, and she said, "Stay visible. When it starts, stay exactly where you are and let your father see you. Don't come to him. Let him come to you." She held Lucia's eyes. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Lucia said. She moved to the center of the room. The center of the room, in the blackthorn, was marked by the largest of the original limestone columns, a structural pillar 12 feet in circumference that rose 40 feet to the ceiling and that every gala she'd ever attended had arranged furniture around. She stopped near it, which put her in the sight lines of every section of the room simultaneously, and she reached into her bag and took out her phone and opened a file and connected to the Blackthorn's event network. She'd gotten the access code from the Foundation's director 18 months ago at a charity dinner, had filed it away, had never imagined she'd use it like this, and she paired the phone to the room's audio system. The Blackthorn Gala had a PA system for announcements and award presentations. She'd watched it used 3 times across her years of attending. A clear tone, a brief interruption of music, a voice that came from everywhere simultaneously. She pressed the button. The string quartet stopped mid-measure. The room shifted. 500 heads turned in the specific synchronized way of crowds when something unexpected happens to the audio landscape. The chatter dropped in stages, nearest to her first, then outward in rings, like throwing something into still water. She looked at the room. She found Roman across it. He was already moving toward her, and Alonso was with him, and there were 2 other men she recognized as security moving from different angles, and she had approximately 45 seconds before they reached her, maybe less. "My name is Vivian Moretti," she said. Her voice came from everywhere, clean and level, bouncing off 40 feet of limestone above her. "Most of you know who I am. Some of you know my family's history with this city and with this organization. Tonight I have some information to share that is relevant to decisions several of you are going to be making in the next 48 hours. The room was very quiet. Roman was 30 feet away, 25. 2 years ago, she said, Eduardo Caruso's organization began an intelligence operation targeting the Roman Vescari partnership structure. The goal was to position a Caruso realignment that would absorb the Eastern port operations under Caruso's framework. She watched faces across the room. The financial board men, the captains she recognized, the old money that had its own interests tied to the structural stability of what her father had built. The operation was run through Marco Ferrante, who served as the intelligence conduit under coercion. The nature of that coercion involved a direct threat to his family. She paused one beat. I want everyone here tonight to understand that Marco Ferrante's cooperation with Caruso's operation was not voluntary. He was compromised by force. Anything he communicated on Caruso's behalf, including information that affected the Buenos Aires renegotiation and the Financial Oversight Board's position this past year, was given under duress. Roman was 15 feet away. The realignment framework that was signed tonight in this building, she said, is built on a 2-year foundation of coerced intelligence and fraudulent representation to the Oversight Board. Any captain, any financial officer, any partner organization that executes on that framework is executing on something that will not survive legal scrutiny and will not survive the scrutiny of the people in this room once they understand what it's built on. 10 feet. She looked directly at Roman. I'm asking everyone present to pause, she said. 48 hours. Before any of you commit to a position on the realignment, give me 48 hours to provide documentation of what I've described. She held Roman's gaze from 10 feet away, while his voice came to her in a low, furious undertone that the PA system didn't pick up and the room couldn't hear. The documentation exists, 3 years of it, and it will be available to anyone who wants to see it. Roman reached her. He put his hand on her arm, not public enough that the room could clearly see it, but close enough that she felt the grip, the specific pressure of it, and she looked at him with the USB drive already in her other hand. She'd taken it from the bag with the phone, and she was holding it between her fingers where he could see it, but where pulling it away would require him to visibly grab her in front of every person in the room who was watching. You're done, he said. Very quiet. Very close. The drive has 6 years of documentation, she said, just as quiet. It goes to 7 different parties simultaneously if I don't countermand the transmission in the next 12 hours. Attorneys, financial regulators, people outside our world who have been looking for reasons to look at your operation for a decade. She looked up at him, and the thing in her eyes was not fear, and it was not triumph, and it was not even anger. It was the specific cold clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose and has stopped pretending otherwise. Let go of my arm. He looked at the drive. His grip loosened. She stepped back 1 step, kept the USB between her fingers where the room could see it if they were looking, which they were because everyone in the room was looking now. And then Marco Ferrante spoke. His voice came from across the room, not through the PA, just his own voice, an old man's voice with decades of authority behind it, carrying across the suddenly silent space of the Blackthorn Foundation Gala, like something that had been building pressure for 2 years and had finally found its opening. What she's saying is true, Ferrante said. The room breathed. I have been providing intelligence to Caruso's operation since March of 2 years ago. His voice was rough but steady. I did so under threat. The nature of the threat was personal, not professional. I want this room to understand that I knew what I was doing and I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway because... He stopped. A sound that wasn't quite controlled, because some things sit above everything else. Across the room, near the north windows, Lucia Ferrante was standing exactly where Vivian had told her to stand. Still. Visible. Her father found her face across 500 people, and the distance between them and the room watched Marco Ferrante see his daughter and understood, in the specific collective intelligence of rooms like this one, exactly what that meant. Roman stood 2 feet from Vivian. She could hear him breathing, hear the specific quality of his breathing, harder than normal, faster, the breath of a man whose board had just tipped over for real this time. Not the controlled disorientation of earlier, but the actual uncontrolled cascade of multiple losses happening simultaneously, and the first cold understanding that managing them sequentially was no longer an option. Alonso was at his shoulder. Alonso's face was doing something complicated. Brescia, across the room, was on his phone. The 2 Caruso men at the bar had stopped being casual. One of them was already moving toward the exit. The other was watching Reyes, who was watching Vivian, who was watching Roman. This is not over, Roman said. No, she said. It's not. She meant something different by it than he did. She could see it in his face, the way he heard the words as a threat, as the kind of declaration that preceded escalation. The chess player reading the next move as an attack because attack was the only direction his mind moved in when cornered. He was already calculating what came next, already assembling the response, already building the counter framework. What he couldn't see, what he had never been able to see, which was the specific blindness that had been his defining limitation across the 30 years of his reign, was that the woman standing in front of him had already moved past the position he was responding to. She wasn't where he thought she was. She had never been where he thought she was. Dominic appeared at her side. Close. The specific closeness of someone standing between a person they're protecting and the direction that threat is most likely to come from, a positioning so automatic it required no discussion, no signal, nothing except the understanding of 2 people who had been occupying the same world long enough to read each other's geometry. Roman looked at Dominic. Dominic looked back at him. 12 seconds of nothing but that. Two men who had operated in the same orbit for 11 years, who had built and maintained and fought for the same empire, standing on opposite sides of a limestone floor with everything they'd shared between them suddenly and irreversibly rearranged. "Dominic," Roman said. One word, a question and a warning and the specific sound of something breaking. "I'm where I need to be," Dominic said. The Gala had gone completely silent. The string quartet was not playing. The wait staff had stopped moving. 500 people in formal wear were watching the center of the Blackthorn Foundation Gala with the held collective breath of an audience that understood, without being told, that what was happening in front of them was not a social incident. It was a transfer of power. Outside the tall windows of the Blackthorn, the Manhattan rain had started. She could see it on the glass, the specific silver black of March rain in the city, running down the outside of windows that separated the room from everything beyond it. The streetlights turned the rain luminous. Somewhere distant, a siren moved through the streets and faded, and the silence inside the room was absolute. Roman looked at Vivian. She looked back. And in 12 years of looking at this man, across dinner tables and boardrooms and the specific intimate darkness of a bedroom she'd shared with him for a decade, she had never seen on his face the particular expression that was on it now. Not rage, not calculation, not the cold management of consequences that was his native mode. Something rawer, something that looked, underneath everything, like the face of a man who had just understood that the thing he'd discarded 6 hours ago as furniture had been, the entire time, the foundation. And he had pulled it out himself. His mouth opened. She didn't wait to hear what came out of it. She turned to Dominic and said quietly, completely calmly, with the rain running down the windows behind her and the room watching, and Roman Vescari standing 2 feet away, understanding for the first time what he had actually done. "Get the car." And Dominic Vale, who had spent 11 years as the second most powerful man in the Vescari organization, and who had swept a dressing room every month for 2 years, and who was standing where he was standing tonight because of a decision he'd made long before this evening, said, "It's already—" She walked through the Blackthorn's north doors and the March rain hit her face, and she didn't stop for it, didn't pull back from it the way you pulled back from cold things. Just let it land. Let it be real. Because right now, real things were what she needed most. The car was at the curb, black, armored, engine running. Dominic's driver, a man named Carver, who had been with Dominic for 7 years and who had, in Vivian's experience, never once asked a question he didn't need answered, stood at the rear door with it open. She got in. Dominic slid in beside her. The door closed. The sound of the rain disappeared beneath the insulation of the car, and the silence inside was the specific silence of aftermath. Not peace, nothing like peace, but the absence of immediate emergency, which was the closest thing to peace available right now. The car didn't move. She became aware after a moment that Dominic was watching her, not speaking, just present in the particular way he was present, which was the way of someone who understood that the first thing a person needed after something like that was not words, but the simple fact of another person not leaving. She looked at her hands in her lap. The USB drive was still between her fingers. She hadn't realized she was still holding it. She set it carefully on the seat beside her and looked at it for a moment. 3 years of evidence. The thing she'd built in the quiet of invisibility. The thing Roman had never thought to look for because he'd stopped believing she was paying attention. "Did it transmit?" she said. 30 seconds after you connected to the network. Dominic's voice was quiet, steady. 7 recipients. It's already in the hands of 2 federal financial regulators, 3 attorneys, and 2 journalists who've been building cases on the Eastern port operations for years. A pause. They can't unring that bell. She absorbed that. The Caruso document, she said, whatever they signed tonight. I have a copy. Brescia kept a duplicate on his phone. He's been documenting everything for 14 months. Apparently Caruso's people required redundant records. A brief dry note in Dominic's voice that was not quite humor, but was the shape of it. Brescia made his own calculation tonight about which direction things were going. He sent it to me 40 minutes ago. Brescia, she said. Brescia has been building an exit strategy for 6 months. He's not loyal to Roman. He's loyal to outcomes. Another pause. He's going to be useful going forward. She sat with that. The rain moved on the windows. Outside, the Blackthorn's facade glowed amber in the wet dark, its old limestone indifferent as it had always been to what happened inside it. "What did Roman do?" she said, "after we left?" Dominic was quiet for a moment. "Alonzo told me before we walked out. Roman, when you turned away from him, when the room had heard everything, when Ferrante stood up," he stopped, chose his words. "He stayed in the center of the room. He didn't leave. He didn't make a scene. He stood there for about 90 seconds, which apparently felt like a lot longer than 90 seconds to everyone watching, and then he walked to the bar and ordered a drink and stood there alone." A beat. The Caruso men had already left. The financial board people were in a cluster by the east column, talking, not to him. Alonzo was the only person who went to him. She thought about that. Roman Vescari standing at a bar in the room he'd intended to triumph in, with a drink he probably didn't taste, alone. She had spent 12 years being lonely in that marriage, and she did not feel satisfaction at the image. She felt something more complicated than satisfaction, something that had grief in it alongside the other things. Grief for what they'd been at the very beginning before the weight of the empire had flattened everything personal out of him, grief for the version of this that hadn't had to happen. But grief was not the same as regret. She did not regret tonight. "The car," she said. "Where are we going?" Dominic reached forward and said something to Carver in a low voice, and the car began to move, pulling away from the Blackthorn's curb and into the wet Manhattan street. She watched the buildings slide away in the rear window, and then she turned forward and watched the city come toward her instead. "There's a safe house," Dominic said, "on the Upper West Side. I've kept it. It's not connected to any Vescari address. Clean title. 3 years of maintenance." He paused. "I had it prepared 2 years ago." She looked at him. He met her eyes and held them. "You've been preparing for tonight for a long time," she said. "Yes." "Longer than I knew." "Yes." His voice carried something, not apology, not quite, but the acknowledgement of a person who has been keeping something and knows the keeping was both necessary and its own form of honesty withheld. "I watched what was happening to you, over years, the way the structure closed around you, the way Roman, not deliberately, or not only deliberately, just systemically, the way the whole thing required you to become less so it could become more." He kept his eyes on her. "I thought, for a long time, that it wasn't my place to interfere, that you were making your own choices. Then I started to think that the choices available to you had been reduced to the point where the word choice didn't really apply anymore." He paused. "That's when I started preparing." The city moved past the windows. The rain was heavier now, turning the streetlights into blurred halos, turning the yellow of taxicabs into something impressionistic and vague. "You should have told me," she said. "Sooner." "I know. Years sooner." "I know." He didn't look away. "I'm telling you now." She held his gaze for a long moment, felt the weight of the evening in her body. The specific exhaustion of having operated at that pitch for hours, of having held everything together through will and precision, and the particular stubbornness that she'd inherited from her father and had once tried to gentle out of herself in service of a marriage that was quietly consuming her. Every muscle in her back ached. Her feet, still in the heels she'd put on 3 hours ago, had gone past pain into numbness. The champagne she'd had, the single glass, had worn off hours ago and left nothing behind. She was tired in a way that went below the physical, tired in the structural way, in the place where years lived. "Don't say something you don't mean tonight," she said. "Whatever you're going to say, wait until tomorrow or the week after. Wait until we're out of this specific night and into something that isn't colored by what just happened." She looked at him steadily. "Because I've made decisions inside moments before, colored by the pressure of the moment. I'd like not to do that again." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. The car moved north through the rain. The safe house was a brownstone on a tree-lined block, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of building that had been standing long enough to have absorbed the memory of several different versions of the city. Carver pulled up to the front. Dominic got out first and looked at the block. Both ends, briefly, the instinctive security assessment, and then came around to her door. She stepped out into the rain without a jacket, felt it on her shoulders and in her hair and on the embroidery of the dress that had been waiting in a vault for 3 years for exactly this kind of night, which she hadn't planned for and which had come anyway. The dress was getting wet. She didn't particularly care. Inside, the brownstone was clean and warm and furnished with the specific sparseness of a space that had been maintained for function rather than habitation. A couch, a kitchen, a table with chairs, walls without pictures. The absence of accumulated personal objects, which was the absence of a life being lived there, but which was also a kind of relief right now. A space without history, without the weight of anything she'd previously agreed to. Dominic hung his jacket and loosened his tie and went to the kitchen, and she heard water running, heard the specific sounds of someone making tea, which was such an ordinary sound inside the extraordinary circumstances of the evening that she felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't realized was locked. She sat on the couch and took off her shoes, set them on the floor side by side, and pressed her bare feet flat against the hardwood and felt the reality of the floor beneath her. Cold, solid, real. Her phone had been vibrating intermittently since they left the Blackthorn. She looked at it now. 14 messages, 3 calls. Her attorney, twice. One of the journalists who'd received the USB transmission already, which meant the documentation had arrived and been recognized as what it was. 2 captains whose names she knew, which meant the news was moving through the network faster than she'd anticipated. A message from a number she didn't recognize that turned out, when she opened it, to be Sienna Vale. I hope you're safe. I didn't know. I want you to know that. She looked at that message for a moment and then she typed back, I know, take care of yourself, and put the phone face down on the cushion beside her. Dominic came back from the kitchen with 2 cups and set one in front of her on the low table. She wrapped her hands around it. The warmth moved into her palms and up her wrists, and she sat with it and breathed. Ferrante, she said, what happens to him? Dominic sat in the chair across from her. He'd rolled his sleeves up. She noticed that the specific changed quality of him outside the Gala context, the way the formality had come down a register without disappearing entirely. He was still the same person. He was just in a different room. That depends on several things, he said. If the Caruso realignment unravels, which it will once the financial board understands what the intelligence it was built on cost, then Ferrante's exposure becomes part of the general reckoning rather than a specific target. He turned the cup in his hands. He's old. He cooperated under coercion. There are people in the syndicate who'll respect that more than Roman expected. A pause. He won't be what he was, but he won't be destroyed. Elena, she said, Lucia has her. They're together tonight. He looked at her. She called from the car 20 minutes ago while you were looking at the city. Something released in her chest. She felt it go. A specific knot she'd been carrying since the sidewalk outside the Blackthorn. Since Lucia had said her daughter's name. Since the weight of a 9-year-old she'd never met had been added to the evening's already considerable load. Good, she said. She drank the tea. It was plain and hot and exactly right. The financial documentation, she said after a while. The signature violations on the asset transfers. How long to build a legal case? 18 months, best scenario. 2 years, more likely. Dominic set his cup down. Your attorney will want to move on the divorce settlement simultaneously. The documentation strengthens your position substantially. Roman's team knew about the signature issues, which is why they wanted the liability clause invalidated first. Remove the clause. They thought you had nothing. They didn't account for the transfers. Roman always undervalued paperwork, she said. He thought execution was everything. He didn't think about records. You kept records. For 6 years. She looked at her hands. Every transfer that required my signature. Every time they processed without it. I kept copies of the originals and copies of what was filed. She paused. I had a lot of quiet evenings. The rain moved against the brownstone's windows. She could hear it clearly now. The building was old enough that sound came through it differently than the penthouse, where everything was sealed and climate-controlled and removed from the basic meteorological reality of the city. Here, the rain sounded like rain. She found she was glad of it. Dominic, she said. Hmm. The sweep. Every month for 2 years. She looked at him. You did that alone? Yes. Nobody else knew. Nobody. She looked at him for a long moment. There were things in that. Things that would take time to fully understand, and time was something she now had. Not the compressed, pressurized time of tonight, but the other kind. The kind that opened forward rather than collapsing inward. She would take the time she needed. Thank you, she said. He held her gaze. You don't have to. I know I don't. She said it simply. I wanted to. They sat with the rain and the tea and the specific quiet of a room that had no history yet, no weight of previous conversations or agreements, or the accumulated residue of years. Just the present. Just the rain. Just two people sitting with the particular exhaustion of having been through something enormous together and having come out the other side still standing. She fell asleep on the couch, sometime past 2 in the morning. She didn't plan to. She'd been intending to stay awake, to review the attorney's messages, to begin building the structure of what came next. But the exhaustion went deeper than intention, and her body made its own decision, and the last thing she was aware of was the rain on the windows, and Dominic in the chair across from her with a file open in his lap, reading, and the warmth of the tea still in her hands. She slept without dreaming, or she dreamed and didn't remember, which amounted to the same thing. In the morning, the rain had stopped. She woke to gray light through the brownstone's windows and the smell of coffee from somewhere nearby, and the specific physical accounting that always came after nights like the previous one. Shoulders tight, lower back aching. The residual soreness of having held tension in her body for hours. Her dress was wrinkled. Her makeup had long since migrated from intention to evidence. She looked at her hands, and they were the hands of a woman who had been through something and had the slightly worn quality of things that have been through things. She felt fine. Not elated, not triumphant, not the clean cinematic clarity of victory. Just fine, in the way you felt fine when you had done what needed doing and were still here on the other side of it. Fine like standing. Dominic was in the kitchen. He'd found coffee somewhere. A can of grounds in a cabinet, probably, and a basic machine. He handed her a cup when she came in without commenting on her appearance, which she appreciated. The kitchen had a small window that looked onto the building's side alley, where pigeons were doing their indifferent pigeon business on the wet concrete, and she stood with her coffee and watched them for a while. My attorney, she said, sent 3 emails. I've been in contact since 7. He leaned against the counter with his own cup. She wants to file the divorce petition this morning before Roman's team can establish a narrative. A pause. Her word, narrative. She's right. Vivian turned from the window. And the financial documentation, I want it in her hands today. Physical copies, not just the transmission. Already arranged. Carver is picking up a full copy from the dead drop in an hour. She looked at him. You had a dead drop. I had several. A beat. Not apologetic, just factual. I wasn't sure which scenario was going to develop. I wanted options for multiple versions of the night. She almost smiled. Who are you? Someone who's been paying attention, he said simply. The day assembled itself around them in pieces. Her attorney arrived at 10, a woman named Claire Sato, who had been Vivian's personal counsel since before the marriage and who had, during the years of the marriage, been kept at a careful distance by the structure of the Vescari legal apparatus. Claire came in with 2 assistants and a bag that contained, among other things, a change of clothes she'd had the foresight to bring, and she looked at Vivian with the specific expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time to be in this room with this client. Tell me everything, Claire said. Vivian told her everything. It took 2 hours. Claire and her assistants took notes with the focused economy of people who were already building something from what they were hearing. When Vivian finished, Claire looked at her across the kitchen table and said, The signature violations alone are enough. The rest makes it decisive. She closed her notebook. He's going to fight. I know. It's going to be ugly. His attorneys are very good. Mine are better, Vivian said. Because mine have the paperwork. Claire looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I should have been more aggressive 2 years ago about reaching out to you directly. I wasn't ready 2 years ago? Vivian said it without self-pity, just the fact of it. I needed to be where I was to do what I did last night. The timing was what it was. Claire accepted that with a nod. Then she opened her bag and pulled out the change of clothes, charcoal trousers, a simple dark blouse, flat shoes that were close enough to Vivian's size to work. And Vivian went to change and came back feeling like herself in a different, quieter way than the dress had made her feel like herself. The dress had been armor. These were just clothes. Both were correct for their moment. The attorney team left at noon with the physical documentation and instructions that left very little room for misinterpretation. Dominic had been on the phone most of the morning, which she'd been aware of at the edges of her attention while she was with Claire. She found him in the main room when she came out, his jacket back on, his tie re-knotted, looking like a version of himself that was the daytime version rather than the gala version, and he looked up from the notepad in his hand and said, "The financial board met this morning, 3 hours ago, without Roman." She sat down. "And?" "The Caruso realignment document has been suspended pending review." His voice was even, but she knew him well enough by now to hear the thing underneath the evenness. Two captains who were positioned to execute on the framework have communicated directly to the board that they want verification of the intelligence that underlay the terms. They're specifically asking about Ferrante's role. Roman's response. He issued a statement through Alonso this morning saying the board's concerns are legitimate and will be addressed through proper channels. A pause. Which is a way of saying he understands the position he's in and is not yet ready to fight it publicly. "He's going to regroup," she said. "Yes, he has resources we haven't seen yet. He'll look for leverage, something he can use to reframe what happened last night." Dominic set the notepad down. "This isn't finished. Not in the syndicate sense. Not for a long time." "I know." She looked at him. "But the realignment is stopped. For now. For now is enough." She looked at her hands on the table. "My father spent 40 years building that structure. 40 years. If I bought it another 40, if what happened last night bought it time for the right people to find a better architecture, that's enough." She paused. "That's actually everything." The afternoon was quieter than the morning. There were calls, her attorney, twice, one of the captains whose name had appeared in her messages the previous night, who wanted to speak with her directly and whom she spoke to carefully, measuring each word the way she'd learned to measure words in her father's house before she'd gentled that habit out of herself. The journalist who had received the transmission, who had questions she answered within the parameters Claire had established. Small, structural things, the scaffolding of what came next. At 3 in the afternoon, when the gray light had thinned to something that suggested evening was coming. Though it was still a few hours away, Dominic came to find her in the main room, where she'd been sitting with her phone and her attorney's notes, and a second cup of coffee gone cold. And he said, "There's something I need to tell you that I should have told you sooner than last night." She looked up. He sat across from her. The same chair as last night, which she noticed. He put his hands on his knees and looked at her directly. And she understood from the quality of his stillness that whatever this was, he'd been deciding how to say it for some time. 4 years ago, he said, "Roman asked me to monitor your communications, your personal phone, your email, the dressing room." He held her gaze. "I told him I would." She was very still. "I swept the dressing room every month instead," he said. "I told him the surveillance was in place. I gave him information, some of it, enough to be plausible, things that didn't matter, things that couldn't hurt you." He paused. "I've been running a version of what he asked for that was actually the opposite of what he asked for 4 years. He thinks he knows what you've been doing. He knows what I wanted him to know." The room held that. She looked at him, at this man who had been inside the machinery of her captivity and had quietly, and without telling her, been taking the machinery apart from the inside. "That's why the dressing room was clean," she said. "Yes?" "That's why the vault was safe." "Yes?" 4 years, she said. "Yes." She looked at the cold coffee in her cup, looked at the window, looked at the room without pictures, the space without history, the clean, empty present of a place that had been built for exactly this kind of moment, for the moment after, for the space where you figured out what happened next. I'm angry, she said. I know. That you didn't tell me. That I was living inside something, making decisions based on what I thought was real. Without knowing that another person was managing a layer of it I didn't know existed. She kept her voice level. Not because she wasn't feeling it, but because level was how she processed things. Always had been. It was how her mind worked. I needed to know. I could have used that information. I had 3 years of preparation and I didn't have that piece. You're right, he said. There's no good argument for why I didn't tell you. There are reasons. I was afraid that knowing would change your behavior in ways Roman would detect. I didn't know how much you trusted me yet. He stopped. They're reasons, not justifications. You deserve to know. She sat with that for a while. The thing was, and this was what she was working through, what she needed time to work through, what she would probably need more than this afternoon to fully work through. The thing was that his silence had also protected her. Not entirely, not cleanly, but the safe dressing room, the secure vault, the 4 years of Roman receiving false information about her activity, that silence had been the condition under which she'd been able to build what she built, under which she'd been able to become, slowly and invisibly, the person who had walked into the Blackthorn last night. He had kept a secret from her that was also, in some tangled and imperfect way, a gift. That didn't make the secrecy right. It made it human, which was different and harder and more true. I need time, she said. Yes. With all of it. She looked at him. With you. With what comes next. With the whole... She gestured, a small motion that indicated everything. The morning's calls, the attorney, the legal machinery beginning to turn, the syndicate realigning itself around the absence of a certainty it had operated under for decades. I'm not going to run from it. I'm not going to make fast decisions. I just need time to let things settle into their actual shape. Whatever you need, he said. Not a bargain, not a condition, just a statement of fact. She nodded. They sat in the room together as the afternoon moved toward evening, two people on opposite sides of a table in a safe house on the Upper West Side, with the city going about its business outside and the rain gone and the gray light slowly warming toward the specific amber gold of late afternoon in March, the kind of light that made old buildings look like they'd been there forever and were prepared to keep standing indefinitely. She thought about her father. She thought about the first time he'd introduced her to the business. Not the surface of it, not the legitimate framework, but the actual thing, the structure underneath. She'd been 17. He'd sat her down in his office in the Moretti house and he'd said, "This is what we are. I need you to look at it directly." Some people spend their whole lives looking at the version next to the thing, the reflection instead of the object itself. You can't afford that. You have to be someone who looks at the thing. She had tried to be that person. She had, for a stretch of years in the middle of her life, stopped being that person. Had looked at the reflection, the version of herself that was Roman's wife, that was manageable, that was safe, that fit inside the space allotted. Last night she had looked at the thing. She was going to keep doing that. She picked up her phone and called her attorney one more time and said 3 sentences that Claire wrote down and confirmed she understood and said she'd file within the hour. Then Vivian put the phone down and looked out the window at the late afternoon light moving across the front of the building across the street. The decision about what came after that was hers, not Roman's, not the structure they'd built together. Hers, with the specific weight of her own judgment and her own history, and the years of preparation and the years before that when she'd been someone she recognized fully, and the years in the middle when she'd been someone she was just starting, slowly and painfully, to recognize again. There would be months of legal proceedings. There would be negotiations with the financial board. There would be the slow structural work of the syndicate finding its new equilibrium in the absence of the Caruso realignment, which would not be orderly and would not be clean and would require her attention in ways she was already calculating. There would be conversations with Dominic that she was not ready to have yet and would be ready to have when she was. There would be time. That was the thing she hadn't believed, somewhere in the machinery of the marriage, that there would be time, that the compression was not permanent, that the space she'd been living inside would eventually open. It had opened. The question now was what to do in the open space. She already knew the answer to that. She'd known it since she stood in front of her dressing room mirror with her face washed bare and said something out loud that she'd needed to say. You move forward, you become the thing you were always going to be if the other thing hadn't happened. You do not spend your energy on the man who underestimated you. You spend it on what you're building, on the decisions you make now that will be real and your own and unmediated by someone else's idea of who you should be. She looked at Dominic across the table, and he was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had been watching her for a long time and had made his own decisions about what that watching meant. Decisions he was prepared to wait to express because she'd asked him to wait. Thank you, she said, for last night, for everything you did and everything you didn't do and all the years between. He held her gaze. I'd do it again. I know, she said. So would I. The light continued its slow change across the room's bare walls, amber shifting towards something darker and quieter, the specific quality of early evening in a city that didn't slow down but that changed tone with the light, daytime to dusk, noise to a different kind of noise, the city's diurnal breathing. Vivian Moretti sat in a room with no history and felt the specific weight of her own, all of it, the good years and the buried years, and the 3 years of quiet preparation and the one night that had changed the shape of everything that came before it. She felt it completely. And then she stood up from the table and picked up her phone and began to make the calls that built what came next. Not the calls she was expected to make, her own. Roman Vescari's empire did not collapse overnight. Empires didn't. They eroded along fault lines that had been present all along, fault lines that became visible only when the thing that had been holding them closed was removed. In the months that followed, the Eastern Port structure reorganized around new agreements that did not include Caruso's framework. The Financial Board worked through an 18-month review that produced 3 separate investigations and one very quiet set of findings that were distributed to a very specific set of people without ever appearing in any public record. Roman fought the divorce proceedings with everything his attorneys had. Claire Sato fought back with the documentation, and the documentation was better. The settlement took 14 months to finalize, and when it did, Vivian walked away with enough to build from, enough of the Moretti legacy to honor what her father had spent his life constructing, enough distance from the Vescari name to build under her own. Marco Ferrante retired. His daughter came back to the city. Elena, 9 years old, curious, with her grandfather's eyes, became a presence in Marco's life in ways that seemed, from the outside, to be rebuilding something that had been damaged a long time ago. Whether it could be fully rebuilt was not something Vivian had the visibility to know. Some things couldn't be fully rebuilt. Some things could be rebuilt into something different that was its own kind of whole. She didn't go back to the penthouse. She didn't need anything from it. The things she cared about were either in storage or in the brownstone or in the Geneva accounts or in the hard drive she kept in a fireproof case, and none of them were objects she needed a floor-to-ceiling view to feel. A year and some months after the Blackthorn Gala, she and Dominic were sitting at a table on the terrace of an old building somewhere along the Italian coast. Not quite the specific place she'd been told as a girl that her family had come from, but close enough that the olive trees looked right, and the sea was the color she'd always imagined when someone said that color. The evening was warm. The wine was local. Below them, the coast curved away in both directions, and the lights of the village they'd come from were just visible at the edge of the terrace's sightline. They'd been here for 3 weeks. They were staying another 2. After that, things required attention that would pull them back. The attorney for a quarterly check-in, the board for a review she was technically no longer obligated to attend but had chosen to anyway, the ongoing management of what remained. But right now, for this specific evening, there was nothing that required anything except being here. Dominic refilled her glass without being asked and set the bottle back and looked at the sea rather than at her, which was something she'd come to understand about him. That he looked away when he was saying something he'd been thinking about for a while, some inverse of confrontation. I've been thinking about what your father said, he said, the thing you told me, about looking at the thing instead of the reflection. She looked at the sea. Yes. I spent 11 years in that organization looking at a version of it that was partly a reflection. He turned his glass on the table surface, Roman was very good at managing what you saw, the version he let you look at. A pause. I knew it was a version. I just thought I knew enough about the actual thing to operate. Did you? Mostly. He set the glass down. Not entirely. There are things I would have done differently if I'd seen more clearly. He paused. Are there things you would have done differently? She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which was a thing she could afford to do now that it was past. The real question, the one without the defensive reflex, the one that looked at the whole span. I would have called Claire sooner, she said. I would have started the documentation a year earlier than I did. I would have... She stopped. I would have talked to you sooner. I saw something in you for a long time, and I put it in a drawer and kept it there because the drawer was safer than the alternative. He was quiet. That's all, she said. Those things. The rest of it, including the years I spent becoming invisible, I think I needed those years to know what I knew by the time I needed to know it. I can't say for certain, but I think so. Your father would have... He stopped himself. Said I was late, she said. Yes. He would have been appalled that it took me until 41. She almost smiled. He was also a man who had his own arrangements that took him until 50 to resolve, so I think he would have understood eventually. The sea was dark beyond the terrace. The lights of the village made a warm noise, not the city noise of Manhattan, nothing like that. Just the sound of a small place with people in it going about the business of their evening. Someone was cooking something nearby. There was the occasional voice, casual and unhurried. She breathed, in, out. The same breath she'd taken on the edge of her bed the night Roman had said 3 words and walked out a door. The same lungs. The same body. Just a year and some months further along, sitting in warm air instead of cold, with the weight of the stone she'd been carrying for a very long time finally distributed differently. Still present, she didn't imagine it would fully leave, but no longer the kind of weight that bent you, the kind you carried upright. Dominic reached across the table and put his hand next to hers. Not on it, next to it, the question of it rather than the fact. She turned her hand over. They sat like that while the evening settled into full dark, and the coast lights came up and the sea moved in its old indifferent way against the rocks far below, and she did not feel the need to say anything else about any of it, because the things that mattered were already known between them, and the things that weren't yet known had time. And time was the thing she had now, wide open and going forward. The woman who had once been called the Ivory Ghost, and who had spent 12 years learning to be invisible, and who had stood in the center of a limestone-columned ballroom in a black dress and spoken the truth into a PA system in front of 500 people. That woman sat on a terrace above the Italian coast and felt the particular satisfaction of being exactly where she intended to be, not where someone else had put her, where she had chosen. That was the whole thing. That was when you stripped it down to what it actually was, the only thing that had ever mattered.